We interrupt the Peppy Seltzer Classical Hour with this bulletin from the WPOD Newswire. Dateline, Chicago. The case of the singing sword has finally come to a close. Or has it? Dwarf detective Billy Baddins, in his investigation behind the death of mobster Pretty Boy DeMaio, uncovered a piece of his own past. From a far-off world called Acryonis, the Sword of Uranus, known here in the Windy City as the Singing Sword, came to the attention of Chicago gangland boss Al Capone. Billy's investigation uncovered a web of conspiracy, double-cross, and revenge, as well as the true brains behind this caper, Billy's client, Julie Lessinger. Time passes, but memories are still vivid for our 4'1" detective as we join him outside the Chicago courthouse for a dedication ceremony he refused to miss. And now you know the story so far, brought to you by Lucky Strike Cigarettes. Remember, kids, save those box tops for your free Billy Baddins Secret Dakota ring. And if you don't have enough box tops, just tell your mother, smoke more. We now return you to our regularly scheduled broadcast here on WPOD, Chicago.
Epilogue. 3 coins in a fountain.
And so,
Proclaimed a familiar voice with some of the power and entitlement drained out of it.
in honor of my daughter, Julia Yvette Lessinger, I give this statue to the city of Chicago.
The likeness made me smile. Although it was only life-sized, Lady Justice would still no doubt impress visitors to Chicago's courthouse. There were little details, especially in her face, that made her imposing, but still reassuring and accessible. Perhaps she would give hope to those searching for her, while others who had crossed her would finally feel regret or remorse. Whatever the case, this statue, just dedicated by Henry Lessinger, was destined to be another aesthetic jewel in the scepter of the Windy City. While the reassuring applause was polite, it lacked enthusiasm, doing little to dispel of the considerable tension in the air. Many in the crowd were questioning the sincerity of Lessinger's gesture. He had forked over a goodly number of franklins to alter the statue at the last minute, pushing back its dedication for another month. Didn't seem to bother the crews working on painting and restoring the courthouse, though. The newspapers speculated that this statue was his last act of atonement for the sins of his daughter. Instead of appearing energetic and vivacious for a man of his years, he looked tired. He wasn't the same man I saw the night of the merger between his corporation and the Rothschilds. A merger that never happened. Once the fire was finally put out, the warehouse district was still standing, sans one warehouse. There was some mild damage to the surrounding storage units, but nothing a little honest work couldn't fix. The cops and public eyes were hardly surprised at finding Tommy-armed thugs among the scorched debris, cooked to the consistency of extremely well-done steaks. When the cleanup crews discovered the bodies of 2 women, though, the flashbulbs twinkled brighter than a cauldron full of elvish gems catching the morning sunlight. One of the female corpses, missing a hand and parts of her skull, was sensational enough. When the other charbroiled body was identified, however, respect for the dead took a flying leap off the pier as newshounds nipped at each other's ankles to get the best angle. In the end, the Chicago Tribune got the most graphic shot, and the first run sold out within hours. If anyone else were exploited on the front page like that, folks in this town would have easily lost their appetites for their morning bagels, flapjacks, or Kellogg's cornflakes. The fact that it was the wild child of one of Chicago's privileged changed the rules. After enduring more than 2 weeks of sensational press on his daughter's fiery fate, Henry Lessinger re-emerged as quite the philanthropist, contributing to charitable organizations, various community projects, and, in some cases, just outright buying approval. He was determined to show that the apple that was Julie not only fell far from the Lessinger tree, but also managed to roll out of the orchard. His former enemy, the Ryerson, suddenly had more funding than it knew what to do with for staffing, guest speakers, and exhibits. Buses appeared in the slums to take kids to Wrigley Field for a Cubs game, all expenses paid by you-know-who. If a school needed new plumbing or supplies, Lessinger was making a list and buying everything twice. He also became a church's best friend, sponsoring repair work for stained glass windows, stuffing the poor boxes, and even clocking in FaceTime and photo opportunities at soup kitchens. He tended not to care whether the congregation was Baptist, Catholic, or Jewish. I guess he was trying to cover all his bases. In the frequent interviews he granted during his acts of kindness, he would comment on how important it was to give back to the city that gave so much to him. A real turnaround from a guy who, if he didn't buy the little guy outright, would quash said little guy like a forest fairy under his financial thumb. He was so set on buying his way back into the good graces of high society friends and working stiffs alike that he continued with this magnanimous behavior for a couple of months. All his gestures leading up to this, a final tribute to his daughter. Problem was, no one really bought into his generosity because it was clear that he was more interested in shoring up his image rather than the community's. It was one thing for his offspring to hobnob with the underworld, but for her to get caught running illicit business? That broke the highest of implicit commandments among the rich. As knights who dishonored their house were excommunicated in my world, so now were the Lessingers in this one. The social elite now tightened their circles, leaving the Lessingers on the outside. Then, the Rothschild merger hit the skids. Eventually, if Daddy Lessinger wanted to hang on to the house, the rolls, and the yacht, the only choice he had was to dismantle his empire and sell it off. And I was willing to make a wizard's wager that Rothschild would place the first bid. I made smiling Irish eye contact with my boy O'Malley, who, on spotting me, turned a darker shade of red than usual. He was probably wondering what the hell I was doing there and why I was grinning. The grin was for Lady Justice, a likeness of my dear Lady Trouble, trapped forever in bronze. Gently stroking one of the braids I'd put in my beard, I couldn't help but contemplate if the artist had somehow caught Julie's soul as well as her face, encasing it forever within this metal homage. Perhaps, on nights when the full moon shone through the courthouse's giant arch window, Lady Justice's smile would widen and her eyes would turn black as orc blood as she surged to life, a bronze harbinger of darkness and evil. A fun daydream, but far too close to what could have been. Miranda, still clapping softly in response to some more of Lessinger's completely insincere comments, leaned toward me. Billy, I still don't get what Miss Moneybags was doing in getting the mob involved with this sword thingy in the first place. Since she was already connected with the Ryerson, why didn't she just nab it herself? Julie was smart that way, I replied. She knew that if she swiped it on her own, it would instantly be perceived as an inside job. And because of her volunteer status and her social association with DeMaio, she'd be right up there on the suspect list. Instead, Julie turned the mob association to her advantage by staying in the background during the heist and then looking duped afterward, thereby acquiring her cherished victim status. Julie also relied on the mob for the dirty work because she needed time to build her own organization. Sadly, her new order started with Daphne. You mean Julie Lessinger was building some kind of mammary mafia? Miranda chortled. Snobby Ice Queen didn't ask me to be part of it. What a sense of humor on this girl. Well, you would have been the more trustworthy of her minions, I'm sure. It happened like this. Julie cleared a primrose path for Tony DeMaio by persuading him that this score would make him the new boss of Chicago. Then Julie practiced a bit of influence over Benny, a born follower, to talk Tony into eliminating the Bagman network one bagman at a time. Once it got down to just the four of them, DeMaio, Julie, Benny, and Daphne, holding on to the sword wouldn't be much of a challenge. But then Benny began entertaining dreams of fencing the singing sword for himself. Big mistake. Double-crossing Julie, you mean? Well, that, and ratting out DeMaio to Capone. Miranda finally took her eyes off the Lessinger statue to gape at me incredulously. Benny ratted out DeMaio? Like a true sewer dweller. During our dinner together, Capone described this numbers guy he barely knew as a good soldier. And when I'd caught up with Benny earlier, it was clear he knew he was sitting pretty. Think about it. This poor kid Mario had been in hiding ever since Tony's bad morning at Sal's, while Benny was walking around in broad daylight, calmly reading the morning paper and getting his shoes shined. Now that he had Capone off his back, Benny's path to the sword was short and sweet because he was one of only 3 people who knew where it was. Charm Daphne, get sword, pop Mario, and leave Julie in the cold to deal with the fallout. That's why he was talking so big about taking over Chicago during what turned out to be our last chat. He really did think he was onto a sure thing. I shuddered to think of a world under Benny's rule. A world lacking style, charm, and class, but overflowing with enough hair cream and dragon piss-scented cologne for every man, woman, and child.
Don't say Benny don't take care of his own.
Thank the fates. It was a world we would never see.
But I still don't get why Julie hired a detective if she was already playing the mob,
Miranda persisted.
And of all the detectives in Chicago, why us?
Why us? I scoffed. Because we're good. That's why us. I gave Miranda a wink. But why hire a private dick? When Tony took to the everlasting fields, the sword went underground, leaving Julie out in the cold. She needed a lead. I guarantee you, she was probably asking every cheap-ass gumheel to take the case, but the bottom line was that no one wanted to even think about crossing Capone.
So you're crazy enough to take on Big Al, huh?
Back home, I stood toe-to-toe with trolls, orcs, giant swamp serpents. I've dealt with worse. With an exasperated huff, she turned her attention back to Lessinger, who now looked as if he would explode with regret over losing touch with his daughter, his precious angel, who fell to earth in a blaze of glory. Poor Dink. For a moment, I felt sorry for him. Only for a moment. He would never know how much worse he could have suffered. He would never guess how deep the corruption of his daughter reached. A dark magic that couldn't be cleansed by any exorcism from any religion. Julie was gone. Best to let sleeping dragons lie. Following the appropriate closing comments, the applause rallied for one last time, and then came the brilliant flashes of camera bulbs, capturing what might very well be Henry Lessinger's last public appearance.
So, Julia Lessinger wanted you to find this singing sword, huh?
Miranda mused as we walked through the dispersing crowd toward the new statue.
But you told me that it was Daphne who had her mitts on it all the time. Why didn't that little flapper make her move when she had the chance?
Well, it wasn't that easy for old Daphne, I said, looking up at Lady Justice and breathing a little easier. It worked. Didn't think I could pull it off, but it actually worked. You remember how I explained to you how the sword was unique? Miranda nodded, her mouth twisting into a skeptical smirk. Well, I continued, Daphne unlocked the sword's... Okay, Baddins, what's a better word to use here besides magic? Let's try this one. Potential. Problem was, she wasn't clever enough to figure out how she pulled it off. So, she kept Julie and me on a wild fox chase while she tried to tap into that potential again. And this time, control said potential.
Do you think Julie knew what you believe the sword could do?
Thanks for that disclaimer, Miranda. You're not making this any easier. That's why Julie kept Dr. Hamill around, I explained. Julie told me she liked to push the limitations of her position at the Ryerson. Translation: she had uncovered Hamill's secret title of antiques dealer to the rich. She probably guaranteed his secrecy by threatening to go to the cops, the press, or worse, the Ryerson Board of Trustees. From the look of the Lessinger collection, Julie was bringing home a few of the Ryerson's prize finds before they were tagged. When she made enough off of Hamill's racket, she could leave with her own tidy little nest egg and a note to Daddy saying his personal art collection was courtesy of the Ryerson, an establishment that he and his ego despised. He would have never seen it coming, and being surrounded by illegally obtained artifacts from a place that had proved his family was no better than country peasants might just have been enough of an embarrassment for him to let Julie live her own life. When Hamill dared to stand up to Julie and threaten her paltry volunteer position over tagging the sword, that was her troll-sized clue that there was something special to it. For Hamill, the sword was a ticket out of Chicago and out from under her thumb. How did Julie know this thing was some free ride to the good life? Don't you know, Miranda? I gave her a bright smile and looked up at the statue. The likeness was incredible. Julie would have approved. Women's intuition. That, and the sword's magic calling to her and just about anyone else of a female persuasion. But I still wanted to avoid the whole magic issue with Miranda, for now. Miranda was about to say something else when she paused. Something about the statue caught her attention for a second. She then looked around at the people, also stopping momentarily as they passed it. Primarily, women appearing transfixed by the new monument. "Let's get out of here, Billy," Miranda said nervously, the color suddenly drained from her face. "This thing is giving me the creeps." Interesting. I didn't count on the sword continuing to have that effect. Sure thing. We stepped out into the brisk, crisp day, taking a moment to let our eyes adjust to the afternoon sunlight reflected off the bright white steps of the courthouse. I never liked that about the government buildings here. The glare was tough on the eyes, especially when you spend a lot of time indoors for a statue dedication. I'm just that type of dwarf who likes to know where he is and what he is about to step into. And had I known what I was about to step into, I would have waited inside.
Hey, Baddins! How you doing, short stuff?
I don't know if Miranda meant to dig her hand into my shoulder like a falcon's talons into its prey, but her grip only tightened when Capone gave her the approving once-over. With a little wince, I gently patted her hand away. There was no reason for her to worry, yet. This was just the next test to pass. "Mr. Capone." I smiled. "What can I do for you?" He shook his head and gave that gruff, gravelly laugh of his that made me acutely aware of how close Beatrice was to my chest.
You're something, Baddins. You're a piece of work, ya. When I heard that you're still walking around, I couldn't believe it.
You and me both, Mr. Capone. I motioned to the gloves he wore, color-coordinated with his suit. How are the hands?
It's still a pain in the ass picking up things, but the doctor says I'm healing up all right. I still don't know what it was with that sword. I ain't never seen anything like that before. I guess I won't ever see anything like that again, seeing as I don't got it.
He held his hand up, the fingers slowly, stiffly, opening up enough for one of his pinstriped orcs to place a stogie in his hold. As they cut and lit the cigar, he bent down toward me and lowered his voice.
You know, Billy, I heard they found that Lessender girl, the dancer, and my boys, but they ain't never found the singing sword.
Ain't that something? I returned in the same hushed manner. You, want to hire a detective to find it for you? Capone gave a few puffs on the cigar, the pleasantries now notably gone from his face.
Do you think I need a detective to find it, or just find a detective that's got it?
I had this urge to get in his face, but why should I? I was the one in control. Are you sure you want to threaten me, Alphonse? Think about that night for just a sec, and take a good look at who's still standing afterward. Capone's boys were only an order away from making us a public spectacle, but the big boss merely nodded, returning to his full height. He gave a slight grunt as he removed the cigar from his mouth slowly, pointing it at me as if it were a sixth finger.
Okay, Baddins, okay. But I'll be watching you,
he said, still nodding.
Even if I ain't around, I'm watching you.
What, taking a trip out of town, are we? He couldn't help but smile at the sparring partner who barely made it past his waistline in height.
Yeah, heading up to Atlantic City. Business trip.
Make sure you don't work too hard. Give yourself a break. Take in a movie or something.
I might just do that.
With a cigar back in his mouth and a nod to his boys, Capone turned to leave.
Stay out of trouble, small fry,
he said over his shoulder. You too, Al, I replied. Not until Capone got into his car did Miranda finally speak.
Billy, what the hell do you think you're doing talking to Al Capone like that?
Don't worry about it, I said, watching the king's chariot pull away.
What do you mean, don't worry about it? I think he gave us plenty to worry about.
Miranda. I sighed. I saw where this was heading. Capone was there when it all went down in the warehouse. He's seen the singing sword, and he knows what it can do. He also knows that after he scampered out of there like a panicked dungeon rat, no one else came out of that warehouse alive, save for one hard-ass dwarf. I gave her an assuring smile. You think he's going to try and tangle with someone who could survive something like that? I saw the question forming in her eyes. The weight was killing me, and a strange relief washed over me when she finally asked,
Billy, what the hell is this singing sword?
Come on, Miranda, I said, taking her hand in mine. Let's go for a walk. We were passing a fountain in Grant Park, a huge mother of artistic and engineering expression. I was afraid that I would have to raise my voice over the loud burble, but Miranda was hanging on my every word. I told her everything. About Acryonis, about Griffinos, the dwarves, orcs, elves, dragons, and the mission to Death Mountain. It all came bubbling up to the surface, returned to the source, and then came bubbling back out again. Guess the Buckingham Fountain and I had a lot in common this afternoon. From the way Miranda's eyes widened at my telling of what really happened the night Julie Lessinger bought the Shire, I could tell that in some weird way, she was buying it. Miranda was throwing me a killer curveball, the like of which would make Lefty Grove green with envy. And that, Miranda, is why Capone, the feds, and Julie Lessinger all wanted the Sword of Run. The singing sword. So bad. Capone now knew what Julie, Daphne, and Benny took to the lower dungeons of Uralon. He now knows its power, and that a little Scrappy got away with only a couple of scratches and bruises from something that only a select few in this realm, and far too many in Acryonis, know about.
Wow. Billy, this is...
Her voice trailed off. Poor kid was quickly approaching that wall folks hit when the brain can't think anymore. She kept looking around the fountain and back at the visible Chicago skyline. Finally, she said in a barely audible, uncertain tone,
Would you, please, get up here for a minute? I want to look you in the eye.
I knew that tone. It was the one I'd heard from a couple of dwarven heartbreakers just before the end of what I believed was a solid union between a man and a woman. It was that tone of vulnerability and disappointment. Because I'd never heard this kind of voice from my girl Miranda before, I knew my confiding in her had turned out to be a good intention gone bad. Damn. The afternoon breeze swept a couple of my thinner braids to one side, while the main ones barely moved. I took a deep breath and looked right into Miranda's pretty peepers. Guess it was going to be time to look for a new secretary. I shouldn't have started running down in my head the list of potential employment agencies. If I had, I could have stopped her hand from giving me a hard shove in the chest. It was a beautiful, clear day. I remember this because as I toppled back, I caught a glimpse of the brilliant blue sky, as crisp and clean as the water I landed into. Still chilly from this morning, it caressed me in all my cracks and crevices like a skilled tavern wench. Crying out underwater usually amounts to a mouthful of water and a lot of bubbles, and I didn't disappoint. Then my brain kicked in with, Hey, Baddins, you're wearing your best navy blue pinstripe and the shoes aren't too keen to water. That was what brought me back to the reality that I was fully dressed and doing the backstroke in Buckingham Fountain. Now I was back on my feet, drowning out the fountain noise around me with the gush of water pouring out of my clothes. If it weren't for my best suit, the pigeons would have taken me for one of those cherub decorations that made great perches, or privies, as I slowly spit out the water in my mouth.
That was for keeping secrets from me, Baddins,
Miranda snapped, her arms crossed tight across her chest. Even miffed to the degree of a battle-raged orc, she still somehow managed to be a cutie pie.
Do it again, and I will quit. And I dare you to find anyone with looks and brains in a package like this.
I put my hands on my hips and gave a good, hearty belly laugh. Ha 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 ha! Swear to the fates, girl, if you didn't keep my office running so well. I slowly worked my way to the edge of the fountain, my movement hindered by the wet clothing and my laughter. I must have looked absolutely absurd. If you think a dwarf in a pinstripe is funny, picture the same dwarf soaked to the gills. I gave an exasperated sigh and looked up at my secretary. I got to stop underestimating you, Miranda.
That you do, Billy,
she snickered, but still with a hint of anger in her tone.
That you do.
The stone of the Buckingham Fountain was warm, so I figured I'd let the afternoon sun bake me for a bit before we returned to the office. Miranda took a seat next to me, close enough that I could flick a small spray of water in her face from my fingertips. She chuckled, but then the smile melted away as she turned back to me.
Billy, if you don't have the singing sword, and both Capone and the feds are still looking for it, then where is it?
I smiled with overwhelming satisfaction. That is a story for another time. The less you know, the safer you...
Billy?
Okay. I held my hands up, hoping the submissive gesture would be enough to keep me out of Buckingham Fountain a second time. I told you that Julie figured out only women could wield the singing sword, right?
Yeah.
Her eyes grew wide.
You gave it to some woman you know.
Well, you could say I work for this woman.
But aren't you worried that this dame will, figure out how it works?
Nah. This lady has her hands full, while with holding scales in one hand, the singing sword in the other, and keeping an eye on the lowlifes who thought they could beat the rap. Miranda had heard so much fantastic stuff from me this afternoon, I feared that this latest bit of trivia would make her head explode.
The singing sword is in the new statue of Lady Justice?
I can't think of any lady worthier of wielding it, I declared, wringing out my jacket. When I heard that Lessinger was holding up the dedication, I made some new friends at the studio where they were creating the old girl. Didn't cost me as much as I thought it would to make these new friends. The singing sword is impervious to damage because it's forged in magic. So we dipped the entire thing in bronze. Kind of turned the sword into a metallic version of a chocolate-covered peanut. And as the artists were all guys, we didn't have to sweat the clear minds issue. Once the bronze shell dried, they worked it into Lady Justice's grasp. We still had enough in the kitty to work in the wee small hours of the morning when no one was around, and to keep these artistes quiet.
So this sword everyone's looking for is going to be on the front page of tomorrow's Tribune?
I laughed at Miranda's observation. You're going to need an arc welder to get to it, provided you can identify it. Even the blade's engravings are hidden by the bronze. Julie wanted to wield the Sword of Acryonis, and she got her wish. I gave the jacket a sharp snap and shook my head. If I hadn't deserved that shove in the fountain, the pressing of this suit would be coming out of your next paycheck. I was pouring out the water from my shoes when I looked up to Miranda, who appeared hypnotized by the building tops that pierced the cerulean blue backdrop.
Go on,
said the kind, soft voice that now caught our attention. It was a mother and her kid. The little tyke couldn't have been older than 3.
Make a wish.
The child looked at the penny in his hand. He was probably thinking,
But Ma,
this is a whole penny. Do you know how far I could go on this penny?
He made a quick, sharp motion with his hand, and of the penny, and its slow, languid voyage to the fathoms of the fountain brought a curious smile to his face. The innocence of the moment brought a smile to Miranda's face as well. She silently pulled out a nickel, closed her eyes, and flipped it into Buckingham Fountain. "What did you wish for, Miranda?" She opened her eyes and smiled.
Now, if I told you that, Billy, it wouldn't come true, now would it?
She stared at the nickel's image, warping under the cascade of ripples on the water's surface.
Actually, it was more of a prayer than a wish. For Julie Lessinger. I'm an old-fashioned Baptist, Billy, but I've never been a real believer in reaping what you sow. I mean, from what you were telling me, Julie got pushed too far by her father and that bookworm Hamill. Doesn't she deserve some mercy? No one should die the way she did.
The way she died, I reflected, or the way I let her die. A question for the ages, Miranda. A question for the ages. I sighed, wringing out my socks. I figured I could change my shorts when we got back to the office. If you love someone enough, will that guarantee they will turn out right? I've seen humans with real troll turds for parents wind up being the greatest of heroes, and I've seen the wealthiest and highest nobility turn on themselves like a pack of rabid wolves delirious from hunger. Did I want Julie to meet her end like that? Hell no. Did she bring it on herself? Maybe. Magic and the power it promises does strange things to people. I slipped back on my socks and shook my head. Sometime, I will have to share with you what I know about it. It's not a lot, but it's enough. I slipped back on my shoes, still damp, but dry enough to handle a walk back to the office where a fresh, dry change of clothes awaited me.
Billy,
Miranda said, a note of apprehension in her voice.
You said that these portals were conjured up by those magician types, right?
Yeah, I grunted. Those necromancers were always pulling rabbits out of their hats or lightning bolts out of their asses. I tell you though, if Houdini were still alive, he'd have a fit trying to discredit them. It's always hard to discredit a wizard when you're missing your mouth, dealing with a third arm growing out of your back, or trying to adjust to your transformation into a patch of bog moss. Miranda simply nodded. That's my girl, so accepting of things beyond the realm of the believable.
Well, okay, so you came through one of these portals along with the singing sword, right?
Right.
So, what else do you think came with you?
We just looked at one another. This was one of those times that I really wanted Miranda to have a severe moment of stupidity. But this was not to be one of those moments. I really didn't know what to tell her. My world book, me, and 9 talismans, each infused with the same level of destructive power, and if brought together, possessing the ability to make the Great War look like a court jester's routine gone bad. One of these talismans turned up in Egypt, made its way to my backyard, and was now on permanent display in a Chicago courthouse. Another was stolen from the Smithsonian by some whacked-out European nationalists. So where were the other 7? And if that wasn't bad enough, what else, besides the talismans, had come through these random portals of oblivion? Wizards. I just hate them. I turned back to face Buckingham Fountain and pulled the fool's gold coin out of my pocket. I'd kept it with me since that night at the warehouse, as a reminder. The coin, with its glyphs and runes carved into it, couldn't catch the light on account of there was no shine left in it to catch. A dead trinket, now surrendering to decay. Still, it was a coin, and appropriate as it now shared a bond with one of those 9 talismans of Acryonis. I closed my eyes, made a wish, and flipped the coin into the air. My thumbnail striking it did manage to coax out of the coin a dull that continued to ring in my ear as it flew. I watched the metal disc flip again and again, its speed creating an illusion of a dozen coins all spinning at once in its little space. Then it struck the water with a hard, loud, and a small spike of water shot upward for a moment, collapsing into a series of rings that extended from the point of the coin's entry. It floated down to the fountain's bottom with a gentle rocking motion, coming to rest among other coins that carried hopes and dreams. And this realm doesn't believe in magic. Hardly.
So,
Miranda asked as she stood up.
what did you wish for?
If I told you, sweetie, then wouldn't come true, I said through chattering teeth, as a light breeze gave my water-soaked self an unexpected chill. Trust me, Miranda, you want this one too.
Okay, boss, we need to warm you up. How about a nice lunch special at Mick's? On me, since it's my fault you might catch your death of a cold.
I hopped down from the fountain's lip. Nothing outside of a black militia skin blanket could warm me up better. Seeing as I just saved this city from a new age of darkness, I think I've earned it. We headed over to Mick's. No doubt we would have to tell the story behind how I got into Buckingham Fountain several times over for Mick and his lunch crew. If that was the penance I had to pay in keeping secrets from my girl, it was a penance I could handle. So we were 1 month ahead on the bills. Would have been 3 if Julie had been able to make that Monday morning meeting and I hadn't become a silent patron of sculptors. Miranda's salary covered, and I didn't need any fun for a while. I'd gotten plenty of that on this case, one way or another, and all I needed now was a break. In fact, I was starting to find a new appreciation for the calmer, gentler days at Baddins' investigations. Besides, I couldn't help but reflect on what the dwarven elders would say to us soldier types when we were all itching for another fight after a war.
Patience is also a virtue of the soldier. Remember, just because the dragon is slain does not mean its children are dead as well.
Yeah, I figured I'd revel a bit in the slow time. Maybe even catch a game at Wrigley Field. Before the next hatchling came knocking on my office door. You have been listening to Billibob Baddins and the Case of the Singing Sword, a fantasy detective novel written and performed by T. Morris. Original music for this podcast, courtesy the incredible talents of Rubber Band Banjo at rubberbandbanjo.com, Evan Stone at asamandrummeth.com, and myspace.com/evanstonedrummer, and George Hrobb at geologicrecords.net. Additional music and sound effects produced by Digital Juice at digitaljuice.com, royalty-free TV at royalty-free.tv, The Freesound Project at freesound.iua.ufp.edu, and The Concert, a classical music podcast at gardnermuseum.org. Cover artwork by Theo Black. Find out more about the artist at theblackarts.com. And now, the Billibob Baddins players in order of appearance.
Danny Cutler, Leanne Mabry,
Phil Rossi,
Victor Cahill,
Joe Murphy,
Scott Sigler,
Philippa Ballantyne,
Chuck Tomasi,
Tracy Hickman,
Mur Lafferty,
Christiana Ellis.
Orion.
Tony Mast.
Indiana Jim.
Paul Levinson.
J.C. Hutchins.
P.G. Holyfield.
Beth Wojcicki.
Paul from Des Moines.
George Robb.
And TD0013.
Imagine That Studios would like to thank the following people for helping make this podcast happen. Gwen Gades of Dragon Moon Press, Natalie and Serena Aaron Morris, Scott Sigler, J.C. Hutchins, Christiana Ellis, Michael R. Menninge of Farpoint Media, Paul Fisher and Martha Holloway of Dancing Cat Studios, David Henn, Podiobooks.com, The Fanboy Smackdown, Technorama, Geek Cred, Hey Wanna Watch a Movie, House of the Harping Monkey, Phil Rossi's Crescent, The Dragon Page Cover to Cover, The Ink and Doodles Creative Workshop, View from the Quad, The Geek Label Podcast, Adventures in Sci-Fi Publishing, Wander Radio, The Sonic Society, The ADD Cast, The Daddy Cast, and Behind the Black Mask. Along with the podcasting community, you, the listeners. Thank you all so very, very much. This has been Billibob Baddins and the Case of the Singing Sword, a podcast produced at Imagine That Studios in Manassas, Virginia, in association with Dragon Moon Press. Order your print copy of The Case of the Singing Sword today at dragonmoonpress.com, amazon.com, or ask your favorite bookstore to stock it and other titles from Dragon Moon. If I missed anyone, know that I appreciate everything you did in the way of advice, direction, criticism, and support. This has been an amazing journey, and I hope you all enjoyed the ride along with me. Again, thank you so much for listening. The end of The Case of the Singing Sword. But Billibob Baddins will return in The Case of the Pitcher's Pendant.